You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that. But it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
On the Jordan Harbinger Show, you'll hear amazing stories from people that have lived them, from spies to CEOs, even an undercover agent who infiltrated the Gambino crime family. You're about to hear a preview of the Jordan Harbinger Show with Jack Garcia, who did just that.
My career was 24 out of 26 years was solely dedicated working undercover. Now I walk in, I'm in the bar. Now there's a barmaid there, good-looking young lady. She's serving me a drink. Hey, what would you like? Usually my drink was give me a Kettle One martini, 3 olives, glass of water on the side. I finish the drink. The guys come in. I'm going to go in my pocket, take out the big wad of money. Bam, I give her $100. If you're with the mob, I say, hey, Jordan, you're on record with us. That means we protect you. Nobody could shake you down. We could shake you down, but you're on record with us.
For more on how Jack became so trusted in the highest levels of the Gambino organization, check out episode 392 of The Jordan Harbinger Show.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Hey guys, whether you love true crime or comedies, celebrity interviews, news, or even motivational speakers, you call the shots on what's in your podcast queue, right? And guess what? Now you can call the shots on your auto insurance too. Enter the Name Your Price tool from Progressive. The Name Your Price tool puts you in charge of your auto insurance by working just the way it sounds. You tell Progressive how much you want to pay for car insurance. Then they'll show you a variety of coverages that fit within your budget, giving you options.
Now that's something you'll want to press play on. It's easy to start a quote, and you'll be able to choose the best option for you fast. It's just one of the many ways you can save with Progressive Insurance. Quote today at Progressive.com to try the Name Your Price tool for yourself and join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on the Prosecutors, we finish, for real this time, sorta, the Leo Schofield case.
Let's get back to Leo, because we just told you that you likely and we would have convicted if we heard what the jury heard based on the prosecution, based on the witnesses, and based on, more importantly, what the defense presented there. But that's a separate question from did Leo do it? Let's talk about what you'd have to believe for Leo to be guilty. Now, this is based on all the timeline that we've talked about, okay? So after Michelle stopped to call Leo and tell him she was coming to get him, she inexplicably just didn't get him. Then for nearly 4 hours, she disappeared. She wasn't with her friends. None of them saw Michelle that night. So if she was just hanging around for 4 hours and intentionally not picking up Leo, then maybe she was with a stranger. However, There's been no one who's ever come forward to say that they were with Michelle that night. No friends, no strangers, no one. But for Leo to have killed Michelle, she must have been somewhere doing something for a very long time, 4 hours. So Leo and his father must have run into Michelle almost immediately after leaving Vince Raynor's house. Now, his house was 15 minutes from the Schofield's home. Leo left Raynor's home at 1:15. Alice Scott sees Leo and Michelle at 1:30. So, in order for that timeline to have worked, Leo's dad and Leo Jr. would have run into Michelle just beyond the view of Vince's house. Barely turned the corner, and there's Michelle. Leo gets out of his dad's car, and he gets into Michelle's Mazda, and the two of them drive off. And even though both the Raynors and the Andersons live essentially next door to Leo Sr., Leo Sr. doesn't bother to stop and tell them that Michelle had been found, even though they just called the police to report her missing a few minutes earlier. And everyone's worried about Michelle. But instead of telling them, either the police or the Raynors or the Andersons, who are all close by, don't worry about it, I know we just filed a missing person report, we found Michelle, they're fine, they're on their way home. He says nothing and goes home. Then you'd have to believe that Leo brought Michelle home, killed her, and then rocketed around the neighborhood, going 120 plus miles per hour, establishing an alibi, making phone calls, figuring out how to cover up the murder, all in about 1 hour.
And you'd have to believe that he did all this without getting any blood on his clothes or shoes. Or he changes his clothes and shoes and nobody notices. Could it have happened? Sure. But there's absolutely no evidence it did. And in fact, there are multiple people who report that Leo was wearing the same clothes that he'd been wearing that night for 2 full days. He also did this without leaving any significant and arguably no blood in the trailer. Or, as we said earlier, he hit her on the head and killed her by the canal. Could it have happened? Sure. But there's no evidence that it did. And in fact, there's evidence it didn't. There are no fractures, no head wounds, nothing. You'd have to believe that the only fingerprints in the car just so happen to belong to the convicted murderer of one, almost certain murderer of another, and likely murderer of a third, a man with a history of violence and rape who just so happened to like to take his girlfriend down to the very dirt road where Michelle would have been found to have violent, abusive sex. You'd have to believe that the same person, known for his intellectual deficiencies, concocted a story that just so happened to fit almost all the evidence we have of what happened that night, or you have to believe that someone concocted it for him, fed it to him, and he has been able to consistently relay those details from that point forward with little deviation. And you would have to believe all of this based on the word of Alice Scott, her next door neighbors, the LaFoons, and the fact that Leo was abusive to Michelle. Which I guess brings us to our theories.
I was going to say, so that's a lot of you'd have to believes. And I think, this is based on what we know now and the time to sit with the trial transcript and to sit with the evidence and see what should be weighed as credible or not credible. So what really happened, Brett? I'm ready to be just blown away by your theory because I really want to know what happened.
Well, I think essentially what happened is what we have talked about up to this point. I think Jeremy Scott is essentially telling the truth. I think that night, Michelle stopped at the payphone. She made the phone call. Jeremy Scott saw her. She offered him a ride. He took it. He directed her to that canal with the intention of raping her. That was what he was going to do. I think he pulled out the knife, and I think she fought back. I think she tried to drive away. He slammed the car into park. She stumbled out of the car. He went after her out of the car, and he killed her right there in the dirt, stabbing her to death. And a combination of because she resisted him, she refused him, she may have slapped him, she fought back. Whatever his reasons, he was a violent person who did violent things, and he did it at the drop of a hat. He beat a man to death with a bottle. He choked him with a cord. He shot another man. He strangled another woman. He was a violent person, and he killed violently. And I think in that moment, that is what he decided to do. And we've talked a lot about the evidence. We've talked about his confession. We've talked about reasons to believe it and reasons not to believe it. But there are two pieces of evidence that I want to talk about. And in previous cases, we've said you look at the whole body of the evidence to make a decision, to decide whether or not something happened one way or another. But oftentimes, there'll be little pieces of evidence that jump out to you. Talks about this in the Adnan Syed case. The fact that they found that Rose in the back of her car wrapped up on top of the map book with Adnan's fingerprints on it, that was a big moment for me. It's not necessarily the reason I think he did it. There's a whole lot of evidence he did it, but it really crystallized things. And there are two things in this case that really crystallized this case for me. The first is something that we've mentioned but not talked about a lot, and that's the blood swipe on the Downy bottle. So, the story told by Alice Scott is that Leo loaded Michelle's body into the back of the Mazda. But if Michelle was stabbed to death and lost half a gallon of blood, where is it? Why is it in the back of the Mazda? Why don't you see lots of blood there? Enter the Downy bottle. At trial, the only real evidence of blood we see is on the Downy bottle in the back hatch of the vehicle. And this, at first blush, seems bad for Leo. If someone else killed Michelle, she was never in the back of the car. But even if she wasn't, even if she was never back there, Jeremy Scott was, to steal the stereo. His fingerprints were found in the hatchback. And let's look at exactly how the blood was described. Quote, this is from the trial transcript. It was a smeary, superficial stain on the bottle. The stain was too limited to go any further than the ABO blood test. So what is more likely? That Michelle was bleeding out in the back of that vehicle, but the only evidence is this smeary, superficial stain on this bottle, or that the blood was left on the Downy bottle when Jeremy stole the stereo. It wasn't directly from Michelle. It was transfer. That's the first thing. The second thing, let's talk more about the car. So as we discussed earlier, there was a major problem with Michelle's car. According to a Mazda mechanic who testified at trial, the flywheel had come apart. Now, a flywheel is a device you have in a manual transmission vehicle. When you start a car with a manual transmission, the flywheel gets the engine going and it keeps it going. It then continues to spin as long as the engine is on, allowing the vehicle to shift gears smoothly and allowing the energy from the crankshaft to spin it at a constant speed. If all that's gobbledygook, it helps you start the car, keeps the car going. That's what it does. But we have a bit of a problem here. The Mazda was an automatic. Automatics don't have flywheels. They have flex plates. Flex plates tend to be thinner and lighter than a flywheel, allowing them to flex and smooth out the energy transfer from the engine to the transmission. Although the use of the wrong nomenclature might seem like a mistake that should raise an eyebrow, it's likely that automatics were still somewhat rare at this point, and even to this day, mistaking a flywheel for a flex plate is not uncommon. So I think we can assume most of what the mechanic said is true. Let's talk more about the flex plate. Flex plates are bolted to the rear of the crankshaft, and they connect to the torque converter's outer shell. It helps rotate the engine during the starting process. The flex plate also interacts with the converter and flexes to smooth out engine performance. There is one significant difference between flywheels and flex plates. Although it's not all that common, flywheels crack, usually because someone has a lead foot and accelerates too quickly. But flex plates tend not to crack as long as they are mounted properly. Once a flex plate does crack, it's usually a flaw of design, not some trauma. It's just mounted wrong, and it's sort of an inevitable thing that's going to happen to your car one day because of the way it's mounted. But there is one rare thing that can cause a flex plate to crack. If the torque converter, which is heavier and more massive, is slammed into the flex plate, it can crack it. And what would cause that? Engine braking. So engine braking is when you shift into a lower gear to slow down your vehicle rather than applying the brakes. This can be a delicate thing, and if the engine is revved up when you do it, the force that will be applied to the flex plate can be severe. Ordinarily, engine braking is shifting from drive to low, but an extreme version would be going from drive to park. And interestingly, that's exactly what Jeremy says he did. The story he tells is that Michelle tried to drive off and he put the car into park. This would almost certainly explain the damage the mechanic found. And what happens when a flex plate fails? The car loses all power, which is exactly what seems to have happened to put the car on the side of the interstate, unable to be cranked or to move further down the road. If Jeremy is making up his story, it is astonishing that he would randomly include a minor detail in the story that just so happens to solve one of the great mysteries of the case. But what if Jeremy isn't telling the truth? That presents a real problem. Just driving down the road is unlikely to break a flex plate. It just doesn't happen. It's not entirely clear how Leo would have broken the flex plate, but he would have had to have done it when he pulled away from the murder scene the last time. The car would not start with a broken flex plate, and with a broken flex plate, it would have been rather loud when running. Alice Scott said when she saw the Mazda pull up, it was silent. And of all the things about this murder, the broken flex plate is one that is difficult and maybe impossible to reconcile with Leo's guilt, but it fits perfectly with the story that Jeremy Scott tells.
I am filled with so much weight because what you guys just heard, I hope you recognize that Brett is not a mechanic, but the massive amount of research he put into figuring out something that no one figured out at trial, which is that there was no flywheel. That's what was testified to. There was a flex plate, and therefore there was no investigation into basically what could have caused this to happen. Now, they did not know Jeremy Scott's story at the time, and this is not one of those things where the flex plate always breaks because of X, Y, and Z. It's actually so rare that I'm not sure you would even be able to guess what happened if Jeremy Scott hadn't kind of dropped this random detail in there. And I don't think this is a detail that was planted by anyone to tell him to say, because no one has ever brought this up as to how the flex plate was broken. Not Aguero, not defense counsel. I don't think Jeremy Scott recognizes what he did. He just knows what he did at the time, which was to push the car into park, which fits well into if the person you are trying to rape, which is what I think he was doing, is running. He's sitting on the passenger side. He can't get his leg over in time to press the brake, which is how another way you would stop the car. And so what he has at his disposal is to push the car into park, which if she has her foot on the pedal to get away, that amount of force would cause that flex plate to break. And because it would have been in park, it would have still been running while he runs out of the car to then stab Michelle next to the car to death, which is why all that blood is next to the car. And how she's able to be dumped right into the canal minutes after she's stabbed, as the autopsy shows. And he never had to restart the car because he wouldn't have been able to at this point. He can just move the car from park while it's still running to drive and drive away, probably pretty noisily, but no one's around to hear. And he's actually trying to get away. He doesn't leave the car there. He doesn't dump the car there. That's his only option because the car just stops. If it's Leo, and let's say Leo kills Michelle by the canal, they're together. It makes no sense for him to slam on the car into park when he's driving away after the car has been parked. It wouldn't have started whatsoever. I mean, the reason there's so much weight for me on what you've just explained about the flex plate is that this was information that could have been researched back in 1987. I don't think the defense could have explained why Leo didn't do it, but I think it adds an element of doubt for the jurors to reconcile with the prosecution story as to how the flex plate broke and to reconcile it with voting to convict Leo. But this was not done whatsoever at the time. And I haven't heard this anywhere else. I'm pretty sure you just Googled the crap out of that, right?
I'm a mad Googler. Very good Googler.
I mean, this hasn't been anywhere else.
And let me just say one other thing about it. So the way it would have gone down is when he did this, he cracked the flex plate. So the flex plate is now cracked. It's on its last legs. He manages to get a few miles down the road. You know, the flex plate is flexing to do its job. And at some point, the crack causes it to break. And once it breaks, the car loses all its power and he drifts over to the side exactly where the car's found. The car's still in gear. Remember, they tried to get the car out of gear. They couldn't get it out of gear. Like, all this fits with that being what went down. Otherwise, it's just a completely random, unlucky thing that the car's flex plate just so happened to break at that very moment as whoever, Leo or his father, is driving it away to dump it somewhere down the interstate, because they're going down the interstate, which also never really made sense why they're taking it down the interstate. I mean, I guess just to get rid of the car. But nevertheless, it's just hard to figure out how it could have happened with Leo doing it.
And let's give credit where it's due, too. And I'm going to get this mixed up, but am I correct that the part of Jeremy's story as to him pushing the car from drive into park was when he was talking to Gilbert King from Bone Valley? I don't think it was written in his confession. Am I correct
I think
about
that's
that?
right. I think that came out then.
It came out during Gilbert King's interview for the podcast, because I remember hearing it, but I read the letters and I don't remember seeing that detail, which makes sense. That's a detail that seems a bit of a throwaway, but in conversation, kind of walking you through it, right? I believe this is the time that they went and talked to him and asked him to talk them through everything he wrote in the letter, and additional details came out. And this is when he said he talked about everything but the actual stabbing. And I say credit where it's due, because I don't think this piece of information has come out anywhere else. So those of you who are like, well, the prosecution should have known this. This is, you shouldn't have voted to convict guilty. This is a piece of detail that wasn't really known to anyone, and it wasn't even put together until Brett just blew it wide open right now. And I mean, because it came out in conversation rather than writing, despite all the credibility issues that Jeremy Scott has with his over-confessing, confessing and drawing back things, this is just a detail that is so insignificant, it's not a major player in the story. It doesn't end up in his letters to the court, his other, conversations about what happened. This happens as you would expect, as minute details do, in conversation when you're trying to set the scene for someone. But it's not such an important detail as that's when I pulled the knife, or that's when I did X, Y, and Z. But for this flex plate issue, that little snippet of the story doesn't really matter. And because of that, when he says it, I can hear him saying it now. It was just pulling into his memory, trying to remember and set the scene of that night. Despite his credibility issues, that particular fact rings true to me, that he didn't make that up, nor did someone tell him to say that. Nor was this really highlighted in Bone Valley. If you have any thoughts about like him being coached by his interviewer, for example, to say something, because this wasn't highlighted as part of the story. It was just part of a story. And this is heavy because I do think Jeremy Scott did it. I don't think this was known in 1987. Was it knowable is a different question. If you had a different prosecutor, if you had a different defense counsel, if you had a different break with the fingerprints matching, because the evidence fits so well, both with Jeremy's own words, but also with what we know about the evidence that night. But without an alternate suspect at the time of trial, I think it was a really, really hard uphill battle for Leo.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought about this a lot as far as how did this happen and who is to blame. And I think there are a lot of people who you can point to as having some responsibility here. One of them is Jack Edmond. And I've gone back and forth on whether Jack Edmond was ineffective. And you guys have heard me talk about this. And on the one hand, I think from a purely legal perspective, he probably wasn't. Just the standard, it's really hard to be ineffective. It's really hard. But practically speaking, he did not do anything that Leo needed him to do. Leo needed him to spend, a couple days researching his case before he tried a murder case.
He needed to read all of Alice Scott's statements, and he needed to read all of the LaFoon's statements ahead of time. I don't think he fully prepared for their cross-examinations. He did a good job with what came out in trial, but he didn't come, loaded and bare, ready to attack their inconsistent statements. So he did a great job cross-examining off the cuff with no research. And you know what? Like 90% of the time, you can get by. Except getting by in this instance potentially means an innocent man in prison.
And I think he definitely bears some responsibility for it, and I think he can't escape that. I think The other person who bears some responsibility is John Aguero, and we've already talked about that. John Aguero was in a position where he could have stopped this. He should have stopped this. And he should have stopped it because of everything he knew. He just wasn't in a position where I think he could have gone forward with a case confident that this person was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And how do I know that? Because I believe Leo when he tells about that meeting. And one of the reasons I believe it is because he did basically the same thing with Jeremy Scott. He had a meeting, just him and Jeremy Scott, right before a big hearing. He has a pattern. He has a pattern of doing that. And so I absolutely think he had that meeting. And so he is to blame. You know, the state of Florida gets a lot of blame. People blame the state of Florida a lot. The one thing I'll say about the state of Florida, I fully understand why you defend a conviction. We've talked about this before. It is your responsibility to defend a conviction. It's the defense's responsibility to attack it. And I don't have a problem with defending a conviction. There is one issue that does bother me, and it's the fact that the state of Florida relied so heavily on the evidentiary rules to prevent a lot of the things about Jeremy Scott that makes you think he was responsible for this, because it wouldn't necessarily have come into a trial of Jeremy Scott. And I get that. And that may be the standard. But you can't ignore the fact that he was familiar with that area, that he had taken girls there before, that he had sexually assaulted girls there before, that he's committed probably 3 murders. These are all things. I think you could get most of that in, actually, under various evidence rules. But even assuming you can't, the state of Florida knows that. And I think they should be considering that. And I'll just tell you, there are times when I have cases where I'm dealing with something where I decline to use procedural methods to prevent evidence from coming in or arguments to be made because I think this person deserves to have that. And I may argue against it, but I'm not going to stop you on a procedural bar when you may actually have a viable argument. I will use procedural bars all day to prevent me from having to respond to frivolous arguments. I will do that. But when you actually have a good one, there are a lot of times I just don't do it. And I kind of feel like maybe the state of Florida should have just declined to argue the procedural part and just say, let's just consider all the evidence and see whether or not a reasonable jury, if they heard all this, would have found Leo guilty. And it's just really hard for me to believe that if in 1987, Jack Edmond had been able to say these fingerprints belong to a known murderer, that the jury would not have had reasonable doubt. And I just have trouble with that.
Yeah, I think that, we've talked about prosecutorial discretion, and we've also talked about having to take actions because they have preclusive effect for other cases. There's a way to basically not argue that procedural bar without saying it's specific to these facts in this case, right? Without basically saying in all future cases, I'm going to allow, procedure out the window. And there is a way to kind of we do that. Not all the time, in very special circumstances. I've used that in circumstances where there's been insanity claims, for example, and there's things that shouldn't be able to come in. But I'm like, you know what? Let's let the chips fall where they may, because I need to make sure that we know what we're arguing about. I'll argue against whatever is coming in, but procedural, let's let it in for this specific reason and this specific set of facts, not for all future cases that I'm prosecuting.
And there's one other person that I think bears some responsibility for this, and it's not the witnesses. I'm not going to blame the witnesses because I don't know what happened to put the witnesses in the position where they told what they told. And this may be controversial to some people, but that person is Leo. Leo is also one of the reasons this happened, because Leo was abusive and because he did, I think, beat Michelle. And he was a person that when she ended up murdered, it was very easy for the authorities, for his friends, for his roommates, for her family, for her friends to all point a finger at and say, he is the person who would have done this. And I think Leo should bear some responsibility for that. I'm not saying he should be convicted for murder because he was a domestic abuser. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying he should have spent 30 years in prison because of that. But I think it is a fact. I think it's a fact that just needs to be accepted. I'll say this, if Bone Valley is accurate and if Leo and the way he presents is accurate, I think he's a completely different person than he was then. I think he has completely turned his life around, and that's commendable. But I don't think you can ignore the fact that if Leo was as abusive as people say he was, I don't know how that would have ended. Because what you see a lot with that kind of abuse is it continues to escalate until a much more serious crime is committed.
I know what you just said is really controversial, but I think what you said is very nuanced and it might be missed by some people, so I'd like to highlight it. It's not saying that because Leo was abusive, this is okay if this is a wrongful conviction. That's not what we think at all. It's unfortunate that the prosecution was able to call dozens of witnesses to talk about just how abusive Leo was. And that despite all the holes in their timeline, I think a lot of jurors were able to look over or potentially just suspend reality and not really think closely about, can I really believe what Alice Scott is saying? Can I really believe this timeline? Even though it wasn't presented to them in that way. They didn't really have to think too hard because they saw before them from lots of different people speaking under oath about the immense abuse that Michelle had to endure during her life. And because of that, the story was one that could be believed, despite, I think, some holes. It's never okay to have someone sitting in prison for something they didn't do. But I think the fact that you have the LaFoons right after the report basically saying, like, what a bad guy Leo is, made it so that whatever may have happened in the 15 months from the time they first spoke to the police to when they remembered seeing the truck and the Mazda together at the dump site and seeing Leo and his dad there was not that big of a leap in their minds and may have made them vulnerable to being molded in their memory because of what they knew Leo to be like. And this is really, really tough because, again, it doesn't excuse a wrongful conviction. But it also makes me really sad when we only see one side of this. And Michelle is the one who is, it's really sad. It sounds like she was met with a lot of abuse before her death. And her death was, unfortunately, kind of an extension of this very violently abusive life that she had. She happened to meet with one of the most irrationally violent people I've ever read of. Reading about the murders that Jeremy Scott has committed, it's shocking how easily triggered he was to carry out some of the most violent acts that I've ever read. And she happened to be there, thinking she probably saw someone she recognized. And what's the big deal of giving someone another ride? She's been in the same situation, without a car, without a driver's license. It's raining. Help a friend out. But he was no friend. And I think this is all important to note because the two men who, are like the main suspects in her life, I think dealt a lot of violence towards her. And to pretend like that didn't happen, I don't think serves this particular situation right. But it also doesn't prevent us from committing these same errors in the future. It's helpful to recognize that if you have a particular defendant who's charged, who does have a violent history, how does that affect witnesses' testimonies? How does it affect it over time? How does it affect you as the investigator or the prosecutor or the defense counsel and how you view this particular defendant who's charged with the crime? Because we've said this about liars, right? Just because you lie doesn't make you a liar. I don't know what would have ultimately happened to Michelle and Leo if they continued that relationship. But by all accounts, it wasn't turning around in terms of the level of abuse. It was very serious. And thankfully, it seems like Leo has completely done a 180 with his life. That's incredible. And I hope that to be the truth. But this is all a very, very heavy reality. And reality is ugly. And there are many facets of it. But I think it helps us to understand why we arrived at where we are today by looking at all of the good, bad, and the ugly of the case.
And I think one of the things you said is so important. It is important, I think, to recognize the role that sort of Leo played in this, not to just cast aspersions on him and criticize him or, try and forgive the state for what it did, but because it's these kind of situations that I think tend to lead to false convictions. I don't think your average false conviction is actually just some completely innocent person who never did anything wrong, who is grabbed up by the police who decide they're going to frame this person for murder. I don't think that's what it is. I think in reality, when you see false convictions, a lot of times it's the police, prosecutors, tunnel vision, focusing on somebody because of something else they've done or some reputation they have, and then building the case and ignoring the problems because of it. And I think that's exactly what happened here. I think the police, they heard these stories of abuse and they believed them. And they thought, like every single one of us does, and every true crime meme, of course the husband did it. And it's not just a husband, he's an abusive husband. And I think when you're looking at these cases and you're trying to think about whether or not there's a false conviction, those are the kind of flags you can look for. You can look for people who are sort of easy targets in some ways, the usual suspects. And I think that's what you see here. And I think that's one of the reasons it happened. And so I think it's important to recognize it, because if you act like that's not the case, then I think you miss a really important lesson from this case that can help us when we're looking at other cases and trying to determine these, because these are hard. This is all hard, right? We think Leo's innocent. I think he should be exonerated. I think Jeremy Scott's guilty. That's what I think happened. I don't know that for sure. I can't prove that. And we'll never know because we don't have a time machine. And I would say we'd know if Jeremy Scott told us, but he's told us several different stories, so it's hard to even know when he tells us. So all you can do is do the best you can and take the evidence that you have and look at it. And I think if you look at the evidence here and you look at it coldly, I think Leo's innocent. That's my position. It's not necessarily where I thought we'd end up. Not gonna lie. Like, when we started this, people would post about Leo Schofield before we knew anything about the case, and I would just roll my eyes and think, oh yeah, I'm sure he's innocent. Yeah, totally framed. That's probably him. But then you look at the case and all of a sudden it really
This is the 1 in a million case.
I mean,
where
it really
the
is.
fingerprints actually come back to a known killer in the area. I would say I'm not laughing at that. I'm literally like exhaling, and this situation never happens, and then it happens, and I don't think we would have come to the same conclusion back during the trial in the 80s. But this whole situation is very heavy.
The thing is, you don't have to take, what's crazy about this case, you don't have to take these huge leaps of logic to believe Leo is innocent. You don't have to discount all sorts of evidence to believe Leo is innocent. In fact, usually what you see happening in these innocence cases is people will discount all sorts of evidence on the basis of like one eyewitness. One eyewitness will remember something weeks, months, years later that's sort of inconsistent with the person being guilty, and people will just grab onto that, like that must be the truth, and therefore everything else must not be right, and we can just discount all this other evidence, and it must have been a conspiracy and all this other stuff. In this case, you have the opposite. In this case, you don't really have any solid evidence that he did it. What you have are some people. You have some witnesses who said he did it, and you have the fact that he's abusive. And that's basically all you have. And then you start seeing all these other problems. And it's kind of, in so many ways, the opposite of what you normally see in sort of an innocence case. In this case, the prosecution's case is all based on, do you believe this eyewitness? Or do you believe the timeline, the way things had to have happened, the fact that there's a serial killer's fingerprints in the car? There is a serial killer's fingerprints in the car. Like, it's hard for me to get past that. Put aside Jeremy Scott's confession and whether or not you believe it's true or he was feted or whatever. I mean, wow, that is like reasonable doubt personified. Fingerprints of a serial killer in the car. Hard for that not to be reasonable doubt, whatever else you may have. Now, no matter how good your eyewitnesses are, when you have the fingerprints of a serial killer in the car, I kind of feel like that's enough to get a new trial, personally. But I wasn't the judge, obviously, in this case.
So Leo has now served about 35 years in prison. And if you listen to Bone Valley, you know that he was up for parole several times. He's never been granted parole. He is no longer on death row, but he does have another parole hearing coming up, I believe, this summer. So that is his next chance of potentially being released.
Yeah, and I think we will be following it. I think most people think he'll be released, but you know, these parole hearings, you never know how they're going to go. So we will be following it, and we will give you guys updates as we have them. Well, Alice, this has been a long episode.
Yeah, apparently I'm starting like a free Jeremy Scott podcast over here, so.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be, you know, we really are bending the rules over here. 8th episode, 8 plus 9.
Yeah, exactly. But hey, that's fine. People like to hear us talk, or so I'm told. We have said a lot today. We probably could talk for another hour, and it would be fine. Really want to hear your thoughts. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you like to go. YouTube. We release videos every week of our podcast if you like to watch on your television as opposed to listening through whatever app you prefer. As I said earlier, we will be at CrimeCon. Prosecutors is your code for 10% off. Come and see us. Or if you want to watch these be recorded live, join Patreon. And even if you don't watch them recorded live, you get to hear them early and ad free. Okay, Alice. Anything else you want to say before we sign off?
This was not like a rah-rah episode. You know, I really didn't know what all we were going to talk about in this last episode. And I think it's best to be described as it's heavy. I feel very heavy for Michelle and her family. I feel so heavy for Leo. I know I said some harsh words about, you know, his abuse and whatnot, but I feel very, very heavy for him sitting in prison marked as his wife's murderer, when what he said all along for 35 years, I think is true, that he did not murder his wife, that he may have done a lot of things, but that was not what he did. He did not murder his wife. And I feel really heavy for Jeremy Scott, who clearly has wrestled with these on his conscience for a very long time. And he should. I think he has done some pretty horrendous things. And whether at this point in his life he's trying to make right or not, I don't know. I don't think he quite knows either. And I do feel his frustration that he's expressed before, where it's like, I've confessed, what more do you need? The problem, as we've gone through, is his confessions are kind of all over the place. My heart is heavy for him as well, for being capable of such immense violence and having other people, one person in particular, Leo, serve time for his crime is an added level of burden that he should bear, and he probably is bearing. And that is an added level of trauma for him as well. And not that there are any winners ever in these types of cases, but I feel sad that there's just, right now, I don't think there's justice all across the board. And it makes me very sad.
Well said, Alice. And I think that's absolutely true. This is a tragedy all the way around, and I don't normally have much mercy for people like Jeremy Scott. Jeremy Scott has done so much evil in this world to so many different people, but you read Jeremy Scott's history, you listen to Jeremy Scott, you realize that this is truly a tragic case on so many levels, and I'm glad we covered it. It's been enjoyable in the way these cases always are, and not enjoyable in the way they always are as well, but I'm glad we did it, and I think, you know, I'm comfortable where we ended up, so we will see what happens in the future. Okay, guys. Well, we'll be back next week. Have sort of a special treat next week. So I hope you guys will join us for that. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
All about overexposure, right? And so if you do it on Super Bowl, you already have a massive audience, the biggest audience ever, because she flew 13 hours from Tokyo and made it on time. Then they win. And then another separate event. Yeah, no, they would make so much more money that way.
He proposes then, and then you have all the post-proposal media blitz. Planning the wedding. And
that's what I'm saying. You're still going to have the media blitz, but then you have the Super Bowl, which you make a bunch of money on. I'm talking about the more eyes on different things. If this was just media, you have the Super Bowl. You already have like massive eyes on it. A separate proposal event with just as much as Super Bowl audience. When else are you going to get that type of audience? Not for the Grammys, not for the Emmys.
Is he going to propose to her at the Olympics? I mean, what is a bigger media event like?
At her show.
There aren't 1 billion people watching her show.
Oh, they would make it happen. They would make it happen. Anyway.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. 1 purchased equals 1 donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.